asked me to do this some weeks ago, and that was to, since we are now into Advent, is to spend some weeks talking about the birth narratives. And the whole purpose of that was to be able to enhance our season of the incarnation experience. And that's what we're going to do. Plus, we're going to try to make it some fun. So we're going to talk about the birth narratives for a few weeks, okay, and what the differences are, right? Because you know there are differences, right? Right? There are differences. And we're going to spend 3 weeks doing that. And by the way, the dates here are incorrect, but I just didn't want to reprint all the slides. They should be the 9th and the 16th. Because I broke the color printer doing this. Don't tell Beth or Mark. But we'll do that, and we're going to spend this first week talking generally about the birth narratives and about Matthew and the genealogy in Matthew and why it starts the way it does. And next week we're going to talk about Luke and how it's different. And we're going to talk about what things are the same in the birth narratives and what things are different in the birth narratives. And then we're going to have some fun in the third week. We're going to really get heretical, because in 1945 at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, okay, in the caves, what was found?
Dead Sea Scrolls.
Dead Sea Scrolls, and among them was found a gospel called the Gospel of Thomas. And it was considered a Gnostic gospel, probably written in the 2nd century. And a lot of people don't know that there were 2 Gospels of Thomas found. There was one with 114 sequential sayings, but there was another one, and it was called the Infancy Narratives of Jesus. And it answers the question that Helen has been asking me for years. So it's going to try to answer that question. Just for you, Helen.
Thank you.
Where was Jesus between the age of 12 when he went to the temple and when he started his ministry? Okay. We don't know if any of that's true. What we do know is kind of fun, because Jesus wasn't a very nice kid. Pushed other kids off the roof and did a whole bunch of strange things. But we'll look at that for fun, and you can decide as great scholars in the church whether or not it should be part of the canon or not, because they're non-canonical. What does that mean, non-canonical?
They weren't approved as the 66 books of the
Yeah,
Bible.
not in our canon. Canon is from the Greek word which means reed or measuring rod. So that's how we measure our theology, how we measure our church. Then we'll take a break for Christmas, and as you know, we've got a number of people going over to the Holy Land in January, and I have prepared, I'm not leading this trip, Mark is, but I have prepared for them a detailed itinerary for all the places they're going to go with the theological statements from the Bible in it. It's about 110 slides, and there'll be a test on it when we're done. And we're going to take those, and for you and anybody else who wants to come, and for them, we'll walk through where those birthplaces and things like that actually were. And the whole idea will be to try to bring it alive. That's why I do this for those classes. So what are the Gospels anyway? In the last 25 years, they've been seen more as literary works, okay, as literature, and to be evaluated as literature. And they were very much in common with what went on in the Greco-Roman world at the time. It was not uncommon in the Greco-Roman world in those days for people to write about people who were famous in terms of bibliographies. So it wouldn't have been uncommon for someone like Jesus to have been written about by others who followed him. It would have been very consistent with what we would have seen in the Greco-Roman world. And why it was done was to preserve the memories of those people. And that's well done. And we can find, For example, other writings that are very similar to what we see in the Gospels, written about other famous people from that time. Okay? But why were they really written? These stories, and I say they're stories because they were literature, were there for the Christian communities. They were there to tell them something about who Jesus was, and to give them a foundation for their faith. And they were there so that you, as a reader, could preach that good news to others, could talk about that good news to others. Because what did they have? What did they have?
Song.
They had the Hebrew Bible. And they didn't have, many people didn't have it. Why didn't they have it?
They couldn't read.
Because it was incredibly, first of all, only 5% of the population could read. And secondly, because it was expensive to make a scroll. We didn't find, you've heard of the word codex, right? You've seen that, C-O-D-I-C-S. A codex is a bound book, the first attempts at bound books. And we didn't see those till a couple of hundred years later. So if you had a scroll, like the Isaiah scroll, it could have been that big. And it was huge. As a matter of fact, when we look at 1st and 2nd Kings, Mark can tell you this because he's a prominent architect. But when we look at 1st and 2nd Kings, why do you think it's 1st and 2nd Kings? Why isn't it just Kings?
Scroll.
2 scrolls.
It would have been too big as a scroll. See, he's really a smart guy. He can just tell. But that's the reason why. So it was really designed to call people to different faith communities. So,
Mind if I dim the lights?
not at all, please, would you? So these were theological documents written to instruct and encourage the people who were beginning to follow Christ. Some 10 years ago when I was in seminary, I had the rare privilege of being taught the New Testament by some prominent people. Okay, and we wrote a book. We wrote a book called Four Gospels, One Jesus that I co-authored and edited. And when Mark and I put this book together, we bickered for a while for what were the Gospels. So what are the Gospels? You would say good news, right?
Sure.
Okay. So his name is Mark Strauss, by the way. He's one of the more premier editors of the NIV, and he teaches at Bethel Seminary and other places. And so what we came up with was a better definition for the Gospels was that. Historical narratives motivated by theological concerns. Because they were historical, right? What do we read? We read about Pilate, right? We read about Herod. We read about the Sea of Galilee. We read about fishing on the Sea of Galilee. We read about what was going on in the time, right? So they really were historical narratives, but they were written around the premise for what is the theological concerns. So this is a nice thing you can do in church, like 9:30, 10 o'clock, when you have people come in and they're sitting next to you, and maybe they're guests, so you don't know who they are. You can ask them what the Gospels are. You can say, no, they're wrong. They're historical narratives motivated by theological concerns. I'd suggest you do this at Christmas. But I think that's something nice to remember. So the things I'm going to ask you, hopefully these are the questions we'll try to answer. Why were these stories different? Any idea?
Written at different times by different people.
Well, they're written by different people. That's a good point. Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
No.
No. Because they never took any ownership of those authors and what they did. There's only one that we got a pretty good clue about, and it is the Gospel of Luke. Because Luke writes to his scribe Theophilus to set the record straight and to tell all things that are true. And he begins the book of Acts the same way, except he starts, the very first verse of Acts says, in my previous work. Okay, so we believe Luke probably actually did that. Okay. But we find that Mark starts with Jesus' baptism and not his birth. And that was the first gospel we believe was written, was Mark, right? And John just ignores it all. What's up with that? Well, probably because he wanted to show the Christology of Jesus. He wanted to show that he was there beforehand. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Remember those words? It's called the prologue of John. Okay? And we're going to explore, was there really a Star of Bethlehem? One of my hobbies is astronomy, as some of you know. And astronomers have looked for years trying to find if it was maybe Venus and Saturn coming together and was brighter in the star, going back in the star charts, and we really can't find that. Okay? But you would make that point maybe because of what was in the Hebrew Bible. Manna from heaven, and following the tabernacle through the desert. People in those days would have understood that. Following. Were there really wise men? How many were there?
Doesn't say.
Why? Where'd
Because
you get that from? Where'd you get three
Nishabur,
from?
they came from Nishabur
It,
in Iran.
Doesn't say
it doesn't
three.
say we think three because of their gifts, I think.
Because of the gifts, right? Probably. But there's no evidence that there were three. And the theological point, which we'll get into, was to show that Jesus appealed to the Gentiles. That was really the reason. But they came from Iran. They were considered magicians. They were considered wise men. Magi.
Mathematicians,
Mathematicians.
astronomers.
That's why BJ is here. I always need someone to keep me honest.
Well, in
And thank
Iran,
God
that's what
Donna just showed up, because now both of them can keep me
No,
honest.
that's what they're considered in Iran.
A
I'm
fuller
not
graduate,
sure.
a fuller graduate over there. Okay. The other thing you'll probably will see is that Matthew was written towards the Israelites to appeal to them, which is why that genealogy begins with Abraham. But Luke's genealogy was to appeal to the Gentiles, and so he begins with Adam. Okay, so it was to appeal to both groups. And does any of this really make a difference? I'm going to try to convince you over the next few weeks that it doesn't make a difference. And a lot of it's what we believe and what's in our heart. But as an example, Helen and I were talking earlier this morning, and we were saying if we divided you folks up into four distinguished groups, and I told the first one of you a little story, and I asked you to pass the story around the group, and then someone to report out on what that story was, I guarantee they'll all be slightly different. Right? And that's kind of what we see here. We see these kinds of differences, but they're not really significant differences. So what our goal is in these next few weeks is to hear the birth narratives with a deeper appreciation for who Jesus was and why these stories were written, why these narratives were written, which is why these narratives are being looked on more and more as literature. So there's some perplexing things in this. Why were the genealogies developed? Why would you start out one of these stories with Adam or with Abraham? What do you think?
To prove their bona fides.
To prove that, for example, with Matthew and with the stories from Abraham, that he came and was supported by the new David, okay, and that genealogy. So that the Hebrew people who knew the Hebrew Bible would be able to say, I got it. He is in the lineage of David, in the lineage of Abraham. And this is what we expect. Okay? And also to show that his father came through that branch. So that's one thing they want to see. Okay? But the genealogies between Matthew and Luke disagree. In Luke we see them coming through Adam to appeal to the Gentiles, for the non-Israelites who wouldn't have cared about Abraham and wouldn't have cared about David. Okay? So you start with Adam and a Gentile, so people who are Gentiles and aren't Israelites or Hebrew. say, that makes sense to me, where he came from.
I have a question, Bill.
Yeah,
Was it the same number of generations in both of those?
no, they're different.
Because as you know, in the star where Christ was born, on the floor, it's got
Yeah.
a number of points,
Right.
each one
Right.
representing a generation.
If you go to Israel, one of my favorite things over there is when you talk to the historians, they will say to you, this happened in or around this place, maybe. Right? In other words, not necessarily there. The crucifixion wasn't exactly there, in or around this place. One of the shocking things, and we'll do this in January, about when you walk the stations of the cross. If you walk the stations of the cross, of which, how many are there, by the way?
14.
9 in Scripture, 14 not in Scripture. The last 4 are in the Church of the Resurrection. Now, here's what's interesting. First time I walked them, I couldn't believe it. I thought I was in Tijuana.
Yes, yeah,
Isn't that right?
yeah.
Get some good buys along the way.
A lot of goodbyes, a lot of goodbyes. But the first time I did it, I mean, you're walking through these alleys and such, you know, and it's really fascinating. And you're selling trinkets and statues and anything else you want to buy.
Sounds.
So you don't always get this real spiritual feeling that you would expect to get as you walk through it. But it's really quite interesting. Another thing is, what was written first, the Gospels or the Pauline epistles?
This is,
You get a 50-50 chance here. Half of you got to get it right. The epistles. Paul's letters were written first. The Gospels came later. Do you find it curious that Paul doesn't mention the virgin birth anywhere?
No.
Wasn't important to him. Wasn't important to him. So we don't see it there. And then we're going to, the whole point though is that the parents must have been divine. And that's the key point. And when we get to Thomas and Nag Hammadi, it's really interesting stuff. My favorite place in Israel is down by the Dead Sea, the Quran, where the Essenes lived and where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. That place is very, very cool.
Yeah.
That place is very, very cool. And all those caves. And you know what? We don't know if they've found it all yet. Isn't that interesting? You never know what we'll find. But that's really an interesting place.
So,
And that's where the Gospel of
John
Thomas.
the Baptist. The
What?
Essenes were John the Baptist.
Yeah,
came out-
we think John the Baptist was an Essene because he was of where he came from and what he did and what he ate and how he's described. He probably was. The Essenes retreated instead of being in conflict with the Roman community. The Essenes said, "I'm done. I'm getting out of here. I'm going to where I can be alone and be peaceful." And they went down to the Dead Sea, and they had running water down there. They had scribe tables, and you can see all those scribe tables. And of course, most of all the Hebrew Bible that we found down there, and much was found, including almost the entire Psalms, was found down there. And that very famous scroll, the copper scroll,
Which one?
the copper scroll,
The COPPER?
yes, written on copper. And that's how we knew it was later. No one had copper in the first century. The copper scroll is a treasure map to where great treasures are buried. So if you have nothing else to do when you're over there, look for the treasure. Really, it's true. Now, the Psalm scrolls were opened by my Hebrew Bible professor, Dr. James Sanders, who wrote several books, including another one I helped him write, which was called Torah in Canon some years ago. And Jim was over there, and they were in a pressurized room in Tel Aviv, and they got these scrolls, and they're dirty, and they're trying to decide how to open them. They don't know how to open them, because as you would imagine, Mark, as you tried to pull them apart, what would happen? You'd lose all the ink and the saturation on the papyrus, and then you'd lose what you have, and they didn't know what to do, and they bickered, and they bickered, and they bickered, and they bickered about how to open the scrolls. And Jim tells a story about one night he went back to the lab and he took out his trusty penknife and started to peel them apart bit by bit. And it worked, and that's how they opened all the scrolls, with a penknife, peeling them back bit by bit. That's how the Swiss Army knife was named.
True story?
Okay, Bill.
True story. True story. Okay, so are these Gospels historically accurate? No. Probably wasn't a Star of Bethlehem, probably wasn't 3 wise men, okay? But that's not important really, because the stories agree and they disagree with each other. But the stories about, we were trying to tell about the Christology of Christ, okay? There's pretty good historical evidence that some of the things are true. As an example, the census. Augustus did the first census, but they did it locally. Okay? So there was census being done for tax purposes. So when we read about that, we can read from the historians that some of those things were did. And there's a very famous Jewish historian, very famous, that Donna knows about, called Josephus. Remember him? And you can get the book of Josephus, which is about yay thick, 2-point type, you know, and trying to read it will take forever. But if you take, and this is what we've done, we've taken books like Josephus and said, what does he say about what happened in that time? And then what we see in the Gospels, and how are they correlated? And a lot of it can be correlated. Right? So we see a lot of that, okay? But remember this, no one can really claim that they wrote the Gospels. We do not know who really wrote them except for Luke, okay? And unlike what Jesus said and did, no one really can claim apostolic witness. So there is clearly a faith perspective here, okay? But what makes Christianity unique? The virgin birth. We didn't have the virgin birth, as Bishop Spong would say. Would it make a difference?
No, it's resurrection.
Probably not. It's all about, she's been in my classes before, I can tell, so but it really is the resurrection. That's what makes it unique. And there's one other thing, and don't ever forget this as we approach the Christmas season. We don't have to earn this faith. It's a gift from God. It's a gift. So do any of those historically accurate things really matter? Not in terms of a Christological story.
Bill,
no.
excuse me. So in Judaism and Islam, the faith has to be earned?
Well, and certainly in Islam it's earned. Not in Judaism. Okay. Remember
Judaism is by birth, right?
Judaism is by birth.
But you have to practice.
But you have to practice it.
And Islam is by birth, but you have to practice.
But you have to practice it. You have to practice it.
And Judaism
This
is
is
the mother.
an interesting
It's through the mother.
little chart. You say, what is the source of this material? Where did it come from? When I say synoptic gospels to you, which ones are we talking about? Come on, kids. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What does synoptic mean? Helen? You know. To see together. Because they were all similar. And they probably, Mark being the first one, we believe it was the earliest one, comes from an unknown source that we call Q, from Quell in German, okay? And that was probably an oral tradition. And those sources filtered down into Mark, and they filtered into Matthew, and into Luke, not into John, okay? What's interesting, if you look at the verses that are common, they call it parallelism between those Gospels. You can see that like 60% of Luke is in Matthew, Mark appears in them all. So you can see that there's been a lot of taking from this Q source and taking from this unknown source which we have, which was a verbal tradition, because how were things passed along? with 95% of the population being unable to read or write. You passed it along by
Oral.
oral tradition. And some writings. So if we
What
look
was
at
the end, what was the end source there you had on that last slide?
it's that they came from a source called, and there's 2 source theories, 3 source theories about how they came together. Dan, but the most important thing just to know, if you know anything, is this Q source, this verbal source that was used, and we've not really found it. Okay, it's been summarized. In 1919, a German theologian came up with that. So if we look at the 4 narratives, if we look at Jesus' birth, in Matthew you see this elaborate genealogy to appeal to the Hebrew people from Abraham through King David. Mark says nothing about the genealogy because he starts with his baptism under Jordan. Okay, and we'll talk about this a little later on. You'll find out that when you go to Israel, everyone wants to think that it's on the Israeli side that he was baptized, but it probably wasn't. It was probably on the Jordan side. And you can see that. And and if you go there and you want to be baptized, you don't have to buy the little water in the jar and the white robe and the whole thing that they sell for $2.95. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. How many times are you baptized, by the way? Once. Unless you're from certain other denominations, which will remain nameless. In Luke, because he's trying to appeal through the Hebrew Bible, which they knew, okay? He's trying to appeal to the Gentiles. So he starts with Adam, okay? And John records it in spiritual terms, which is why, what year are we in now in the liturgy? Starting today, C. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we're now in Luke. So all the readings will follow the Revised Common Lectionary from Luke, with one exception. John will be interspersed throughout the year and dropped in where it's appropriate. So John is recorded in heavenly terms, as in the prologue. In the beginning, before time, before creation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Okay? And what's significant? Matthew says Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecies. Okay? Mark says it's not important. What's important is the baptism. And the word immediately. How many times is the word immediately? Well, let me ask it differently. You'll find the word immediately appears in Mark more than in any other book. It appears like over 40 times. Luke is appealing to the Gentiles among the poor, bringing good news. It was pretty tough to live in those days, just even to get enough food to eat. And you were under persecution by the Romans. You were essentially in the diaspora since the fall of the temple, right, in 586. And so this was the good news, that everyone was welcome. This is what made Jesus so unique, okay? Okay? And John about shining his light across everyone.
Can I ask one question about, did the Romans persecute the Essenes? Or when they went to
No,
the
because
desert?
that's why they left.
Yeah, they went to the desert, they were left alone.
They were left alone. Yeah.
But
they
if
were,
you stayed in Jerusalem,
you
then
were persecuted, probably. You know. Now, if you were a Jew, a good Jew, and you paid your taxes, okay, that's pretty much what they wanted. They didn't want the tax base corrupted, particularly under Augustus. So if you paid your taxes, you were pretty much left alone.
Like Herod.
So by working with the chief priest and the chief rabbi, okay, especially Gamaliel, okay, by working with them, that's how they kept the peace. Okay, so there was this kind of agreement, okay, between the Sanhedrin and the Roman government about pay the taxes, that's okay. You and the Sanhedrin, you guys keep your Jews under control, make sure they pay their taxes, you know, and this is why when Pilate's approached, he says, you know, what's he done? Right? Which we'll get into. So if we look at the similarities, we won't go through all of these, but I thought this kind of interesting. Mary and Joseph were legally engaged, but they had not yet been married and consummated their marriage. Joseph is of Davidic descent in both. Okay, there's an angelic announcement about coming. What archangel of the seven? How many archangels are there? 7, right? Okay, which one always makes good news announcements? Gabriel. It's always Gabriel who makes the good news announcements. Okay, conception by the Holy Spirit. Okay, an angel states Jesus is the Savior. The birth takes place. So these are the things that are common that we find, but we do find differences. Okay, Matthew begins with the genealogy to show Jesus' heritage, and then tells of the miraculous conception. Okay, and he makes a reference to a stable and a manger and the shepherds and the donkey. Okay, and if you look at the details, it's interesting. Probably really wasn't a manger. You wouldn't necessarily stay in a manger. You probably would have stayed in the first floor of someone you knew's house, because the animals were housed on the first floor to be protected and taken care of. And you would sleep on the roof a lot of times. Why would you sleep on the roof?
Cooler.
And it was safe.
Safe, you wouldn't be wrong.
Dan?
I was gonna say, so this is your Christmas message to us. There's no star, there's no wise men. There's no manger.
No, perfect.
Were there any shepherds around any place?
Probably not. Now wait a minute, you're gonna get upset, But I say it's about Christology. If it's December, how can shepherds be minding their sheep in December when it's cold?
Well, it's Israel, they get that cold.
Somebody has to mind them.
Someone had to mind them. What I'm telling you is those things aren't important. It's not important whether there were 3 wise men or there was really a Star of Bethlehem. A lot of things were put together in the story like that so that they would understand the story in their time, like following the tabernacle through the desert. And we're going to see there's many parallels to the Hebrew Bible that they would have understood. But these things aren't really the things that are, I'm sounding a little bit like Spong here, aren't I, Aunt Allison, you know? But these are the things that are important. But right, I'm telling you, those things aren't. If you take the Bible literally, you're taking it incorrectly. This whole idea of literary translation, or what I call inerrancy, has only been around for 75 years or so. You know, so are you worried, Dan?
Well, I will tell you one thing, good thing Carla's not in this class, you could some
That's okay. I have an order to hear Allison. You know, she can straighten me out.
You can throw the books at me, I guess I miss.
You know, Bill,
Yes.
I like the idea, whether it's true or not,
Me too.
that not only did the Magi who were the rich heard the word,
Everyone heard it.
everybody, the shepherds were the lowliest
That's correct, they
of
were the lowest, that's right.
They were
And that's the key
ostracized.
point.
And
That's the
so
key point.
you've got one end to the other.
That's exactly right. And you know, let's face it, we don't know about a lot of these facts historically. But the stories were told for exactly why you said that, you know, Donna. Do we think Jesus was born on December 25th?
No.
Good, thank God. Because probably not.
Well, December didn't exist like it does.
Doesn't
today
exist like
anyway.
it didn't exist like it does today anyway. You know, it wasn't until Bishop Radius in the 3rd century that they came up with December 25th to replace pagan holidays. You know, so he could have been born later. By looking at, you know, like for example, like the census and things like that. Herod didn't ask for the census. It was the following emperor who asked for the census. So the timing doesn't quite work out. But let's look at the differences. Matthew, the Annunciation is made to Joseph in a dream. In Luke, it's made to Mary. In Matthew, Joseph is advised to divorce Mary, okay? And Joseph looks at it totally differently. In Matthew, he tells the Magi and Herod ordering children to kill. Remember that? Okay? Luke doesn't talk about that at all. Okay? He talks about the shepherds. Luke speaks of the census. Okay? Matthew doesn't make the census at all. Maybe you can continue to go through this. Do those things make a difference to our faith and our theology and our Christology? No. But they sure are interesting. They sure are interesting. But it's a matter of looking at a point of view of literature. Are you still worried? Dan, you still worried a little?
Oh, I'm worried about everything, yeah.
Good. Dan and I worry about a lot of stuff, Allison. I love the women of the Hebrew Bible. They're the foundation of the Hebrew Bible. There's a wonderful book, Helpmate, Harlots, and Heroines. Did you ever hear of it, Allison? It's a wonderful book. And it tells the story of the women, first person, of the Hebrew Bible and what they did. Okay? And it was very unusual to include any women in any kind of genealogy. Why?
This is all male. Everything was paternal.
That's right. Right. But we see in Matthew 1:17 mentions them for a reason. Because women play a critical role in the history of the Hebrew Bible. And it's why, they say Mary Magdalene was a prostitute because of where she came from. No, there's no evidence of that at all. None. But the Catholic Church didn't like this idea of a woman being too close to Jesus. And it's just the truth. Don't I always tell you the truth? Right? But if you look at Matthew's choices, Tamar, she was left childless after her husband's death. She disguises herself as a prostitute and sleeps with her father-in-law to continue the family line of Judah. You can't make this stuff up. Right? Look at Rahab. She was a Canaanite prostitute who protected the spies when they went into Jericho, okay, and made it possible for the Israelites to go into the Promised Land. Ruth. She was a Moabite. Where is Moab? What's modern Moab today? Where is it? Jordan.
Wow.
Jordan. Okay. Ruth, we know her story. I think it's one of the most beautiful, loving books in all of the Hebrew Bible. And she's the grandfather of King David. Okay. Bathsheba, my favorite. We all know the story of Bathsheba, right? Okay. And then, of course, Mary. But look at this. Look at this. Mary, she had this unique marital situation. She would not have been revered because of being pregnant. And every one of these women had some kind of difficult life in making decisions about what they did and was in that genealogy of Jesus. So it's like Donna said, is that everyone is welcome. Think about that story. Everyone is welcome. Even these women are welcome into my faith, into my traditions. Isn't that powerful? Wouldn't that be powerful? We're supposed to say yes.
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 Good.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, so what did Matthew start? Okay, Matthew started to make a Christological declaration that Jesus was God at his birth and was the Messiah. And the early church was understanding because look at the infancy narratives this way. They point us backwards to the Hebrew Bible. And they pick up those traditions, which they would have had and they would have understood, at least orally, and they point us forward to Christ. So what are they? They're like a bridge. They're like this bridge that connects the Hebrew Bible to Christ that we see today. When we do the pageant at 2 o'clock, we blend these together, don't we? Right? We blend together Luke and we blend together Matthew, okay, to tell this story. But look at those narratives as a bridge. The oldest part of what makes it unique was the resurrection. that was the story that was passed on that made Jesus unique, and that's what we find out in the Pauline epistles. And I love the verse in Romans, by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus was designated Son of God according to the Spirit of holiness. It's that resurrection that makes it. Without the resurrection, what do we have in Jesus?
Good person, a prophet.
A good prophet. It's that resurrection that makes everything unique. So Mark starts with Jesus' baptism under Jordan, okay, and doesn't talk about the birth narratives at all. But also Mark shows the revelation that Jesus is the Son of God. You know, you are my Son, and I am well pleased. Okay, okay. Luke and Matthew make it clear that Jesus was God from birth. Okay, and we see the birth of the Messiah in 2. So you can begin to see how these pieces are all glued together. So here's a fair question. Why wasn't Jesus accepted as the Messiah by the Israelites?
He was not approved one according to them. They wanted a king and not a lowly
They
carpenter's
wanted
son.
a king. He didn't fulfill, and we can argue about whether the messianic prophecies in Isaiah were really about Jesus. No, that's another subject. But right, he didn't fulfill that mission, that vision, to take them out of the diaspora. Remember, it was the Babylonians who overran them in the temple in 586 and destroyed the temple, and they were in the diaspora for those 70 years, and they had little deli shops and that in Babylon, right? Okay, and then they were restored and they came back. But he would not be bringing the Jews back to Israel. He did not utter in a world of peace. He was a corrupter. He was a corrupter. He was someone who really set the tone differently and was outspoken. And he liked to eat a lot. We often see him at dinner a lot of times. I don't think he cooked too much, but he certainly liked to eat a lot. Okay. So Jesus appears on the scene about 350 years after the prophecy had ended, and it was viewed that he probably couldn't be a prophet. So this is why to this day the Jews really can't accept him. They're still waiting for the Messiah to come. Probably not going to happen. Probably not going to happen. Nazarenes. We only see the word in Matthew applying to Christ, okay? Meaning you came from Nazareth, okay? But it carries all the way back into the Judges, and the Judges took a Nazarite vow, and the last judge was Samson, who had the long hair, and if you were a Nazarite vow, in Numbers, you took a vow that said you would abstain from wine, vinegar, grapes, raisins, that's actually out of Numbers, intoxicating liquors, okay? And Samson took this vow, which was why Jesus is viewed as a Nazarite, because he did all these things. I would not be a Nazarite. I could not do that. I couldn't give up the wine.
He gave up the wine.
Huh?
Well, you can give up the raisins, I think.
He didn't give up the
Bill?
dinner.
No, Jesus didn't give it up.
Think about it, back in that time, wine, because it was fermented and it killed bacteria and so forth, seemed like to me, you had to drink wine or vinegar, because it was safe to drink as opposed to water.
Yeah, it was. And it wasn't like our wine today. It was mostly fortified with raisins and things in it, which the alcohol level would come up, but it did have those properties. The Church of the Nazarene, of course, is named after Nazarene, and it's kind of interesting. If you look at what the Nazarenes believe, they believe that they should live sin-free lives. They should live sanctified lives, and that disobedience to God should really occur if you live a sanctified life. You see, one of the things we see in both of these Gospels, particularly in Matthew, is it follows a lot of the times the leaving Egypt. Okay, You know, when Jesus leaves, when Mary and Joseph leave with Jesus and go to Egypt, okay, the parallels to exactly what we saw happen in the Exodus, for example. They draw these stories like this, so people say, oh, I get it, that's like with Moses in the Exodus. They were in the Exodus, they went to Egypt, and they were following the tabernacle, just like following the Star of Bethlehem. They drew these parallels, the authors, because they're things that they would have understood. And that was very powerful. Take the story of Isaac. Okay, Isaac's birth was promised Abraham, so was Jesus, right? She was barren. Sarah was barren. And God said to Abraham, I will bless her and give you a son. And she says, yeah, I'm 93. Figure that out. Right? I will bless her and she shall become nations and kings of peoples from her. Jesus becomes a king of nations. Okay? So you can see that there's these parallels again. Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring. And in Jesus, what do we see? He's the mediator of the new covenant, okay, and the new resurrection. So you can see the parallels in these stories and why they would relate to them as they would do this. Egypt, the story of Joseph going down to Egypt, and the reconciliation with his brothers, right? Remember the story about the coat of many colors, and the brothers are jealous, and they bury him. He is found by some traveling Egyptians. He's taken to Egypt, okay, sold to them. He helps them with their 7 years of famine, okay. He finally calls his brothers down, and there's a big reconciliation at the end. What's all Jesus about? Reconciliation, right? So again, this would be a way of saying, who is Jesus? He's like Joseph. It's about reconciliation. And they would have got that. They would have got that. It would be like us. It would be like us today, you know. For us to recognize stories, we would want to see things that were about stories in our time, right? Those are the things we would recognize, and these are the things they would recognize. So this is that story. You could read it, and I put in red where there are parallels about these stories. So the key point here in all of this is look at the parallels to the Hebrew Bible. They're telling these stories almost like these antiphons to the Hebrew Bible, so that people would get it and say, well, that's just like Joseph. That's just like Moses. So to make that case, that Christological case. The Magi. Really interesting with the Magi. There's no mention of three. Some people think it's because there were three gifts. But we know the old hymn, we three kings of Orient are, you know, not necessarily, no one says three. But the fact that they were mathematicians, some people say magicians, BJ would say mathematicians, but that was really what they were, really. They were very, very good at math, and for their day especially. Okay? But there's again here parallels to the Hebrew Bible and to Numbers. Again, they would have understood these stories. The star, we can't find it. Astronomers, when I use the royal we can't find it. They made several attempts. The closest they've come to is they may have been with Jupiter and Saturn crossed on the equatorial plane, okay, and they would have made a bright star in the sky. But I don't think it's one of those things. But there is a parallel again. What did they follow in the Exodus?
Cloud.
The cloud. There again, following the star, like following the cloud. They would have gotten that. You could see someone saying, well, it's just like following the cloud. They would have gotten those kind of relationships. If Dan left, because he got too upset probably. Herod. Herod he's reminiscent of the Pharaoh who, right, tried to destroy Moses and the Israelites, right? Again, those parallels. So you can, I think you're getting the point. There's these parallels, right? And if you were an Israelite, you would see these parallels.
But Herod is a historical figure,
Yeah, yeah, definitely. No doubt,
but just
definitely.
the wrong time frame.
When it comes to the census, when it says the census was ordered by Herod, it was probably not Herod, it was probably the later Octavius. So,
But wasn't there Herod Agrippa and Herod?
yeah, there were
Antipas?
several, the two
Herods.
sons, and Herod Antipas and Herod Agrippa. Yeah,
Okay.
that's right, okay. The Magi, okay, this is exactly what Donna said. God reveals himself to the Gentiles through nature, okay, and to everybody, and that was the powerful part of that.
So the names of the Magi in the opera, you know, them all in the Night Visitors, that's just fiction?
Yeah, pretty much,
Okay.
pretty much. Oh, what they did is they found some Magi magicians who were named that, and they said it made sense that it might be them. It might be them. But here's another story in the story. The Jews refused to worship the newborn king. Instead, the king and the chief priests and the scribes conspire against the Messiah. Herod decrees his death, but Jesus spares Jesus and brings him back to Egypt. And so a thing I always ask is, where are we in that story today? Right? Where are we doing what Jesus asked us to do
Is
today?
any of this historically accurate, or this is the myth?
No, that's historically accurate. Where are we? One of the ways I like to read scripture is to say, where are we in the story? You know, we try to read and say, well, what does that mean? Flip that over sometimes and say to yourself, where are we in this story today? Where do we fit in? And in the season of Advent, okay, it's about anticipation. What is Advent all about? About anticipation. And that's what these Gospels try to do, is give us this anticipation, okay? And, what? Got to say, word someone say something. But just kind of keep that in mind for Advent. It's all about anticipation and where we're going. And don't worry about the differences. They're going to exist.
And did they locate a place in Egypt that they thought that Mary and Joseph went to?
No,
Or is
not
that-
to my knowledge.
What about the new findings that have occurred in Alexandria?
Well, maybe, you know, remember, what did we lose that was the biggest resource we could have had?
The
library.
The
library.
library.
But they have re-established the library, and it has, I mean, a new library has been built.
Yes, but
The scrolls are all gone.
The scrolls are
Right.
gone, but they
Yeah.
are,
here's, BJ, you can go and you can find stories about anything and what people believe,
right.
you know, and that's a matter of what your faith tradition, you know, really is.
Right, well, I lived in Egypt for
I know
5.5
you did.
years, but after I left, they made major archaeological finds in the harbor.
Tell us about that.
Well,
We
I-
have 4 minutes.
Well, the Ferris Lighthouse was famous, and it had never been found, and then somebody found, I don't really know, I left. But I do know that a lot of the things that they have brought up off of the floor of the sea have found their way into the new Alexandria Library that is a UNESCO and
It's a UNESCO
international.
site, isn't it? Yeah.
And I know that it was designed, and it's really beautiful. I've seen pictures.
Mm. I just know this, we're constantly finding new things,
Right.
you know, archaeologically, you know, it's,
There was, someone found a ring that said pilot inside it, this was in the paper this past week.
oh, really? I didn't see that.
Yeah, actually, the ring was discovered in 1960, but it had been put away. It was by Israeli archaeologists, but the ring said P-I-L, well, I don't know how you
For
spell it.
pilot, yeah.
Pilot, so.
You know, I think it's fair to say we're pretty sure, we know Herod existed, we know Pilate existed. You know, we know about those things. They're in the historical record.
Yeah.
What their interaction with Jesus was, that's in the Gospels, well, we know that if you were a non-Roman citizen, you would be tried and crucified, right? If you were a Roman citizen, you could not be crucified. which was why Paul demanded an audience, okay, with the emperor.
Because
Right.
he was a
So,
Roman.
because he said he was a Roman citizen from Troas, and he was a tent maker, and he had earned his citizenship. Okay, so we know a lot of that's true, you know. But where Jesus exactly fits into the story, he didn't have. Remember this: Jesus did not have much interaction with the Roman government. He was mostly in Galilee. All right, that didn't come later. It was really the Jews, the Pharisees in particular, and the Sanhedrin who had a problem with him, because they felt he was preaching and talking about heresy, overthrowing God. Who are you to say you're God? Now I know you could be God if you want to be God, but who could possibly say that? I mean, that was heretical. That was heretical, you know. So thanks for putting up with this. I got to get to work.
Sound good.